Hello and welcome to Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. Thanks for joining the conversation. I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Let's talk about accelerating the transition to a sustainable, carbon-neutral society. We're talking plastic in a series of interviews, and today we'll take a deep dive into plastic recycling and the environmental impacts of plastic, aluminum, and glass beverage containers. Based on a recent lifecycle analysis published by the National Association for PET Container Resources, or NAPCOR, the industry group whose members make the 485 billion polyethylene terephthalate or plastic number one bottles that line the shelves of groceries and convenience stores around the world. That 485 billion bottle number, by the way, it comes from 2021, and those bottles frequently end up as litter in the environment. We're joined by Lauren Laibach. She is Director of Data Services at NAPCOR, and she'll discuss the organization's new analysis, which shows that on a head-to-head basis, PET bottles have a lower environmental impact than glass and aluminum beverage packaging. In 2021, 28.6% of PET bottles and packaging was recycled, which lags behind the EPA's reported 2018 data for metals, when 70.9% of steel cans and 50.4% of aluminum cans were recycled. However, when other aluminum packaging and foil is included in the total, the aluminum recovery rate falls to just 34.9%. We're almost back to the level that the PET bottles are. NAPCOR's executive director, Laura Stewart, said that the new life cycle analysis shows, quote, a PET bottle is 100% recyclable and can be made with 100% recycled content, unquote. That is an inherently controversial statement, and we'll do our best to tease apart those complex findings today. You can learn more about NAPCOR's PET plastic life cycle analysis at napcor.com. That's NAPCOR, napcor.com/LCA-report, LCA-report, napcor.com, LCA/LCA.report. Let's get into the conversation. Welcome to the show, Lauren. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. Can you tell me a little about NAPCOR before we start? NAPCOR being an industry organization, a lot of people would like to know more.
Sure, yes. So NAPCOR is the trade association for the PET packaging industry in North America. So we include companies in the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and we encompass the full value chain for PET packaging, from resin suppliers, container manufacturers, equipment suppliers, testing labs, and also the recyclers.
Okay, so we're talking to somebody who represents the entire life cycle of this product, and that's great to understand before we start the conversation. Now, your analysis, the other thing that I wanted to ask you before we get into the results is that it's based on the volume of beverage that you package. So it builds on the idea that in order to deliver 1,000 gallons of soda or water, you would use bottles, cans, or glass bottles. And I want to ask, why is a volumetric analysis the right basis for understanding the efficiency of the packaging?
Sure. The main reason for this study that we chose it is it allows for comparing containers of different sizes. Mm-hmm. So, a 12-ounce glass bottle or aluminum can, which are very common sizes in those containers, versus a 16.9-ounce or a 20-ounce PET bottle, which is, again, very common for those container systems. So it normalizes the basis of comparison to a much larger volume of beverage. Actually, we're looking at 1,000 gallons delivered. So we can make those comparisons. But we also recognize that consumers might be making choices that would substitute one single serve beverage package for another, regardless of the volume difference. So we did include a sensitivity analysis that's based on an equivalent number of containers rather than volume. And on this basis, some of the benefits of PET versus aluminum change, they drop below the significance threshold for a couple impact categories, but largely the results are very similar.
And last kind of qualifying question before we get into the results is the paper was juried. Were the reviewers independent and unconflicted, or do they have plastic industry business relationships?
No, they don't have plastic business relationships. Two of them are professors affiliated with universities in Michigan, specializing in either sustainable systems or packaging. And the chair of the panel had previously worked for Coca-Cola in the 80s and 90s and has since been doing environmental life cycle consulting, but no specific affiliation with PET or plastic packaging.
Okay, great. So now we've set the stage. Thank you for doing that.
Sure.
There's a lot of information here about the various types of packaging, but I want to focus on the 16.9 ounce bottle, soda bottle, PET, the 12 ounce aluminum can, and the 12 ounce glass bottle. In just the broadest brush strokes, how do they compare environmentally? And we'll dig into some of the details here.
Sure. So obviously, a major category is global warming potential, greenhouse gas emissions. The PET bottle for soda has a significantly lower greenhouse gas profile than both of the alternatives. And of the three, glass has the highest carbon equivalent emissions.
Now, those emissions are generated by the process of either refining the raw material or recycling it. And generally, when I look across the table, plastic performs about 50% better than the other two substrates. Why is a plastic bottle, and I know this is an overly simple question, but why is a plastic bottle more efficient or more environmentally friendly? Can you summarize that based on the fact that it is on how it is processed and where it is processed?
Sure. So, there's a lot of life cycle stages that are included, and we do break down impacts based on each stage. And we actually include secondary and tertiary packaging too. So, multi-packs sold in stores, tier sheets to separate, in transport, stacked, pallets of containers, that kind of thing. So as well as the label and the caps. So there's a lot of components, and then we break the primary container life cycle down into stages of raw material extraction, actually manufacturing the container, and then there's the transport steps, getting the container to the filler to the distribution center, then to the store, and then the last big piece is the end of life disposal. So that's where recycling rates come into play. So for the PET bottle, the end of life disposal impact is much smaller than for aluminum and glass.
Is that because it takes less energy to make another PET bottle, or is there a different function that accounts for the lower impact?
It's based on rates of landfilling and waste to energy versus recycling. So I think, to the extent that incineration is part of the mix of, disposal in the United States, that has a big effect on the global warming potential, landfill gas also. And I think the fact that PET is so lightweight, particularly compared to glass, has a really big impact in those cumulative emissions at end of life. So I wish I could answer a little more specifically, but I haven't dug into the disposal data set enough to really answer
so
that.
Let me try to summarize where we are, because again, it is a really complicated topic, and there's a lot of data in your report. And I do urge people to go read it for themselves rather than just take this conversation at face value. But you've accounted for all of the packaging, including the various components of each of the types of packaging, the caps, the lids, the separators, and everything you were talking about. And what I hear you saying is that if the PET recycling rate were better, it would be an even better material to choose when you were choosing a beverage package. Is that essentially the summary of the finding?
That's a good way to summarize. Yes. We know from a previous study that the impacts of a recycled PET resin versus a virgin PET resin is better in all categories. The one exception there is water consumption due to the
Mhm.
washing process
Right.
needed to, wash the used containers. So it's environmentally better in every sense, except it does use a little bit more water to have higher recycled content in PET.
So we talked about the fact that on a package by package basis, plastic is about 50% better than aluminum or glass in terms of GHG emissions. Uh, Water consumption to do this, how do they compare overall across the three different types of packaging? Again, it looked about 60% or 40% better.
Yeah, so it depends on the particular sizes that we're comparing. So, for the greenhouse gas emissions, the comparative percent difference, I think you're right. For aluminum, it's about um, just checking my table here, 40, 60, 65, 66% better. It's a much higher difference for glass because the glass impacts are really, top of the charts for all of the impact categories. So then if we look at water consumption and the meaningful differences in those impacts, it's the same general story. There are actually inconclusive results for PET versus aluminum. And that means that the difference between the two packages didn't meet the significance threshold
Mm-hmm.
established in the study. So for water consumption, that's a 25% difference. So inconclusive for PET versus aluminum, but PET does consume significantly less water than glass does.
Now, all three of these packaging types, produce byproducts that contribute to acidification of oceans and eutrophication, which is they encourage algal blooms. How do they compare? And can you talk a little about how we might begin to limit the release of those materials? Is the industry working on that?
Sure. So for acidification and I always struggle with this word, eutrophication, the
Mm-hmm.
PET impacts are significantly lower than the glass and aluminum alternatives. And in terms of reducing those impacts, I mean, as I mentioned, one of the great insights of the LCA is that allows us to see which life cycle stages contribute most to the total impacts.
Mm-hmm.
So for these two categories, with PET containers, one of the most impactful stages is the raw material extraction.
Mm-hmm.
And we model based on an average survey of recycling and knowing, how much resin goes into bottles on an annual basis. The average recycled content in bottles is about 10% in the US. And that's what was modeled in the study. That means that 90% of the raw material is associated with petroleum and natural gas extraction. So what this means is that a really key way to reduce emissions in these categories is to commit to using more recycled content in packaging,
Mm-hmm.
which is a huge trend in the industry, something that many of our member companies are doing.
I want to talk more about that in a few minutes, but the last thing to ask about is the smog formation potential. These figures were based on processes. They look at the emissions that contribute to creating smog, obviously, but were the comparisons head to head? Were the different facilities that were examined using scrubbers on their smokestacks or other outputs in order to limit theirs and perhaps the aluminum or comparable glass manufacturing environment wasn't? I mean, so was it really a head-to-head competition of similarly environmentally responsible practices?
Yeah, it's a great question. We tried to the extent possible to normalize everything on a national basis.
Mm-hmm.
So for all the material systems, the electricity generation modeling was based on an EPA resource. They update their e-grid database annually. That includes almost all electric power on the US grid. It's really comprehensive. So, that data set averaged across the entire country is what informs this modeling. So to the extent that emission scrubbers were in use for the year that we're looking at in this study, those would have been accounted for in the US grid electricity averages and applied to all the three material types.
Okay, so again, it sounds like you're really making a genuine effort to compare this head to head. We've established why the volumetric approach is the right way to think about it in terms of the amount of stuff we can deliver given a certain environmental impact. Now, there's a lot of things that the plastic industry can do better. And I think you all frankly acknowledge that. We're in the midst
Absolutely.
of an energy transition too. Are NAPCOR members following the lead, for example, of tech companies that are getting together and cooperating to purchase renewable energy in order to accelerate their transition from fossil fuels? Is the plastic industry making those kinds of efforts?
Yes, yes, it's definitely a top issue that the PET supply chain is concerned with. Um, I can mention some strategies that our
Mm-hmm.
members are taking to decarbonize their operations. Some of them have partnered with organizations like Carbon Trust and the Science Based Targets Initiative. Um, we have members that have certified emissions-free electricity, members using biofuels in their operations,
Mm-hmm.
on-site renewable energy generate, on-site renewable energy generation, purchasing renewable energy credits, and also prioritizing low embodied carbon materials in purchasing decisions, which is a great recognition of the fact that upstream, of what a lot of our member companies are doing, there's embodied carbon. So
Mm-hmm.
really taking a comprehensive look at the carbon footprint on the whole. So we're really encouraged by the number of members who have specific sustainability goals and transparent reporting pertaining to emissions reduction. And a lot of them have, annual reports linked on their company websites, and we have all our members' websites linked at our directory on napcor.com.
So then the other thing that a lot of effort could be put into is reducing the need for water by reusing it and treating it for reuse by the facility. Is that another area where NAPCOR members are making an effort? And how are you trying to encourage them in that direction?
Sure, sure. So NAPCOR does not have any established guidance at this time. I can say that some members do have, internal systems to capture and reroute water to reduce the amount of fresh water that's being drawn for their operations. From a NAPCOR perspective, I can say we recognize that water consumption is the one environmental area, as I said earlier, where recycled PET does have a bigger footprint than virgin resin. Um, so as recycling rates and recycled content in packaging increase for PET, I imagine this will be an issue that requires additional attention. But at this time, we don't have any guidance there.
So theoretically, the more we recycle, the more water we're going to need for that process, unless we find a way to truly reuse it. So that I think that's something to underline and keep in mind, folks, as you're thinking about your packaging choices. Now, in general, how does NAPCOR facilitate cooperation around reducing environmental impacts? Is there a genuine dialogue going on? And are you thinking outside the box, or are you staying comfortably inside plastics space? You know, this is what I think a lot of people are concerned about when they hear the word plastic, is that it is just the fossil fuel industry fobbing off another material on us and not trying to genuinely make the changes that we all need to take in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a valid point, and it's an area of huge concern today. I think our member companies and really the industry at large was really in big anticipation of this study being released because it does take that objective lens if we add up all of the cumulative impacts for a packaging system, like we talked about, including the raw material extraction all the way to the end of life container disposal, adding all of that up and being as fair as we can in assessing all of the impacts. What does a plastic package really do to the environment
Mhm.
compared to alternatives? Aluminum cans are increasingly billed as the eco-friendly alternative to plastic bottles, but our study shows that the greenhouse gas footprint is higher for your typical aluminum can versus a typical PET bottle. Um, So there is a big commitment in the industry to just putting fact-based, scientifically scientifically sound information out because we believe that consumers do want to make the right choice and drive the best environmental outcomes with their decisions. So by making this information available, we're really hoping to disrupt some of that narrative because it is challenging assumptions in a big way.
Well, and I think this really brings us to the topic that we'll spend most of the rest of the conversation on, which is improving the recycling rate to make this truly circular. And what I'd like to do is take a quick commercial break, and we're going to come back and explore that topic. And we are back to continue the conversation with Laura Laibach. She's Director of Data Services at NAPCOR, the PET Bottle Industry Association, who recently released a new lifecycle report showing that plastic bottles are less environmentally impactful than aluminum cans and glass. Lauren, we've talked about the fact that the recycling rate when it goes up will involve more water use, and there are things that can be done to begin to limit that. But recycling in general for plastic is very challenging. We know that overall only between 5 and 6% of all plastics are recycled. 28.6% were of PET bottles recycled. We need to get to the kinds of rates you see in aluminum cans, which range between 62 and 73%, and glass bottles are even at 38% recovery rates, even though they're not recycled very much. It's a very strange environment. How do we bring plastic into truly competitive or comparable performance with those other kinds of materials?
Yeah.
What do we need to do?
The thing to understand about the PET recycling supply chain is that it is very much a supply constrained system. Mm-hmm. There's incredible demand for using post-consumer PET in packaging. Many major companies and brands have stated commitments. We're even seeing legislated requirements in states like California requiring a minimum recycled content in bottles that are manufactured there. So there's the demand side is absolutely there to increase recycled content rates. The main factor, keeping the system where it is and recycling rates low is the lack of supply, which means lack of post-consumer PET bottles being collected. Mm-hmm. We need more of those containers to feed the recycling operations. And in order to do that, it's NAPCOR's belief that that's got to come from policy change.
What policies are you suggesting we change?
Sure. Yeah. An easy example is deposit return systems, which have been shown throughout the world to drive recycling rates upward. And even in the U.S., we see the states that have a deposit return system, even states that have a 5% deposit, versus 10%, versus 10 cents in states that have more recently updated their programs. A 5-cent deposit applied even to just, beer and soda containers can drive up a recycling rate significantly. So, NAPCOR is in support of well-designed incentivized collection or deposit return programs. And we have, some stipulations about what well-designed means, drawing from existing programs that perform best, out in the world today. But that's kind of the big solution in terms of generating supply is to incentivize the collection of containers.
Well, I think it makes sense. If you can throw something away and it's worth nothing, versus if you pick it up, it's 5 cents. Somebody else at least is incented to pick it up if you didn't take the time to return it. So practically speaking, from economic terms, it makes sense. Are you in favor of extended producer responsibility organizations being established on a state-by-state basis? Or is that something that you think should be addressed simply with the deposit system and not with all of the additional requirements that go with an EPR approach?
Yeah. So obviously packaging EPR is really new in the US. And NAPCOR has some principles around EPR systems best practices there that we support. One of those is that investment from EPR systems needs to go back into recycling infrastructure. That's key. And, I think that we view this issue a little bit differently, in that the EPR tends to have the most impact on producers and the way that they operate and organize, whereas the deposit return more directly impacts the consumers and gets at that incentive to get the container back into the system. Obviously, EPR can also, improve the recycling infrastructure with, directing that investment back into the collection infrastructure and things like that. In terms of how that's actually structured, there are a lot of unknowns right now. One thing that NAPCOR does support is shared financial responsibility among the producers, and that producers get, first right of refusal to their products that enter the collection stream. Because
that's a really interesting point, and one that as I was reading this, was struck by several times in the course of the report, which is there's also this tension within the industry about getting back your own materials. If you've spent the time and effort to make sure it is collectible and collected, you want it back if you're Coca-Cola or a Pepsi, because it's less expensive than having it go into the system where costs are added and then sold back to you. Is there a move to begin to create closed loop circular economies around specific bottling companies' packaging?
I wouldn't say that brand specific packaging circularity on that sort of granular scale, but certainly as EPR has entered the policy discussion, that is something that bottle manufacturers are concerned about. And another thing to note about the historical end markets for recycled PET is that for most of its history of being recycled in the U.S. and Canada, the primary end market has been textile fiber. So clothing, carpets, exactly. So we are seeing a shift now that bottle end uses have grown in recent years and actually have overtaken fiber as of 2020 for US and Canada combined. And that's the industry responding to legislative requirements and commitments that companies have made voluntarily. But fiber is still a very large end market. And I think, from NAPCOR's view, we don't subscribe to circularity being the ultimate goal. Okay. A lot of people refer to other non-bottle uses for recycled content as downcycling. But when you think about a polyester carpet that can last for decades in your home and remains in use for that amount of time, it is really adding a lot of value. And so it's, NAPCOR is a little bit agnostic on end uses, but we do acknowledge that there's, the fiber industry is also, in high demand for recycled PET. So that comes back to the issue of supply. How are we going to get enough post-consumer PET or polyester, from the textile industry to meet everyone's need for recycled content?
Yeah, and you can see it in the price of recycled PET right now. It's been rising over the course of the past few years, and there are months in which it will spike because everybody wants it and they can't get enough. As we move into the next phase in recycling technology, and just to remind our listeners, in 2018, the United States recycling industry sort of hit a crisis because China stopped taking a lot of our used stuff. And there has been a lot of new investment in new technologies. We've had a couple of those companies on the show, Carbios, which is a enzymatic recycler, a couple of weeks ago. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to have Nexus Circular back on the show for the second time to talk about their approach, which is a chemical recycling process. How does NAPCOR view the potential for chemical and enzymatic recycling of PET? Is it a viable near-term innovation?
Yeah, I think we view it as a very promising future for chemical and enzymatic recycling. In the US, there's large investments being made in chemical recycling, specifically for PET and polyester. Companies are already procuring feedstock to run as their plants are, nearing coming online. So I would say it is a near-term innovation. And as an example, Eastman's US plant is due to start up later this year, and they have announced another plant with a location undisclosed at this time, in partnership with Pepsi. So we're hopeful for their success.
So if in fact those things don't work out, and so far the evidence seems to suggest that we will have something more like aluminum, and which is almost infinitely recyclable. But if it doesn't work out, what else could the industry do to improve its plastic recycling performance? Because at the end of the day, the problem starts when the bottle escapes the system and gets into the environment. What can we do to stop it?
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, the well-designed deposit return systems that incentivize collection is one key piece. I would also point to advancements in robotics and sortation technologies. These improve bale quality and yields. They also are helping to make sure that, from the first point of sortation at a material recovery facility where PET is potentially getting lost to other streams, not getting into the PET bale, this advanced sortation can help make sure that, every recycled commodity gets where it's supposed to go. NAPCOR is on the steering committee for the PET Recycling Coalition, which is an initiative of the Recycling Partnership. And, this work is centered around grants that catalyze new technologies with the goal of capturing more PET containers, specifically the non-bottle packaging, which we call thermoforms in the industry, plus color and opaque bottles and containers for recovery, which, have been a little bit more challenging for our reclaimers.
Well, and in fact, you just hit on several things that the chemical and enzymatic approaches eliminate as a problem, because you can separate the pigments, for instance, in the plastic as part of the chemical process of breaking it down. But then, still, and to hit on this point a little bit more, there are countries where the recycling rate for aluminum is above 90%, China and Brazil, for instance. Can we get plastic recovery rates even up to the 50% level that aluminum is at in the United States right now this decade? Do you feel like there's a plan in place to achieve that?
I would say there is not a plan in place at this time.
Okay.
There is an unprecedented level of policy interest in getting there. There's been an explosion of legislative initiatives, both in the space of deposit returned and EPR. There's a lot more momentum than we've ever had to get towards a plan that could get us to that place. So that's very encouraging. But, these things take time. There's the legislative process, and then there's the regulatory rulemaking implementation stage. So, the likelihood of getting above 50% by the end of this decade, I would say, is unfortunately pretty low.
Okay.
But, that doesn't mean we should stop trying, because as we, further the policy conversations and get to a solution that, works for all stakeholders, that will become possible. We just need to find what's going to work here in the United States for this particular culture and this, vast space that we occupy.
So let me ask it a slightly different way. And that is, right now, there's a goal in the industry to use 50% recycled PET in bottles by the end of the decade. Do you think we can get enough recovery to do that?
Realistically, I don't think so.
Okay. And these new technologies, the plastic recycling technologies, also can take old plastic, such as from out of a landfill, and start to bring it back into circular use. Do you see that as a goal that the industry shares, or are they interested in basically making a lot more raw plastic from virgin petroleum?
No. Actually, we've seen virgin resin companies acquire PET reclamation facilities in recent
Okay, that's good.
years. Yeah, I mean, there's a broad acknowledgement that, the the future is, you know, more recycling. It's more circularity to the extent that we can achieve that. And so I think there's agreement that we need to get recycling rates up, and there's more energy to try to make that happen than there has been. But I just we're coming off a decade of stagnant recycling rates, and there's been no
Mhm.
major policy shift at this time. And so, given the time lag that it takes to get something in place. The 2030 goals. I mean, individual company goals are entirely different. I'm talking about,
The industry.
nationally,
Yeah.
50% recycled content in all bottles. We're at 10.5% as of
Mhm.
2021. So it's going to take a huge lift to get to 50. And I don't think that's possible in 7 years. But individual companies with goals to get their operations to a certain point, that's entirely different. And that's certainly helping to push the industry in the right direction too.
Uh, do you have any advice for our listeners about how they can help move this forward, whether it is asking for a specific policy or simply finding the companies that are doing the right thing and trying to support that by shifting their spending to them?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of products, packaging products, will have a percent recycled content listed right on the bottle, so you can look for that when you're making your decisions about what you want to purchase. Buy recycled is
Okay.
kind of a strategy there. And yeah, I think there's always room to educate ourselves about the kinds of policies that, I mean, it's very hard. It's a very complex landscape. Even as someone
Mhm.
who works in this industry, it's very arcane to look through legislative proposals and try to parse out what is actually being proposed here, what are the implications going to be. So I mean, it's a challenge to get into the details there, but I think putting forward support for policies that are going to help improve the recycling system in the United States. And, broadly, I would say those include deposit return systems, although it does depend how they are designed.
Mhm.
There's devil in the details there. So, I mean, broadly speaking, look for, you know, working with policymakers who are at least interested in moving things in the right direction. But
Does that need to
it's a
be at
tough space.
does that need to be at the federal level, or do you think this is really a state by state issue at this time?
Ah, the momentum of getting things done so far has
Mhm.
been state by state. It certainly would help in terms of harmonization and efficiency, getting, everybody on the same page and having, one set of requirements to meet instead of 50 if there was, federal legislation. So I'm certainly hopeful that that could be something, down the line. But near term, I think the states are taking action, and we need action now. So
Well, Lauren, I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me about this, and I urge everybody to go take a read and understand this more deeply themselves and ask questions, because I think that's really where we are, is a point where consumers and companies need to get together to understand how we're going to get out of the pickle we're in. And we can't count on our 50 states to agree on anything, so it's on each of us to make that change. How can folks find out more and follow along with what NAPCOR is working on?
sure. We have napcor.com is our more industry focused website. We also have a consumer oriented positively PET um, website. That's positivelypet.org, that highlights, some of the lesser known environmental benefits of PET packaging. NAPCOR and Positively PET are on Facebook, Instagram. You can find us if you're looking
Okay.
for us.
Well, thank you very much for spending time with us today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your questions.
We've been speaking with Lauren Laibach. She's the Director of Data Services at NAPCOR, which is the National Association of PET Container Resources, about its recent life cycle analysis comparing the environmental impacts of PET bottles, aluminum cans, and glass bottle packaging. The NAPCOR study illuminates a challenging fact that on some levels, plastic can have fewer environmental impacts than other materials. For example, we're all encouraged to buy reusable fabric shopping bags to eliminate the need for a single-use plastic shopping bag as an alternative. But on a head-to-head basis, a single organic cotton shopping bag carries a carbon footprint 150 times or more greater than a single-use plastic bag. Is that a fair comparison? Probably not. But that doesn't mean we should choose plastic. It just suggests there's an obligation to use the cotton bag 150 times or more to actually reduce our impact. Buying a new fabric bag every 50 trips to the store because you like the new design adds up to a larger impact than opting for a plastic bag each time you go. So there's no simple answers in a complex economy struggling to come to terms with its wastefulness. We need to be more aware. Plastic is a controversial material. We should not choose to buy it simply because it can be recycled. The recycling infrastructure needs heavy investments to improve recovery and processing rates, and the packaging that we buy needs to be designed to be recycled. We all need to buy less plastic and ensure that any plastic we do buy is recycled instead of entering the environment, whether you send it to a landfill or it ends up as trash discarded on the side of the road. Everyone who reaches for a plastic bottle of soda or water on the grocery shelf should accept that responsibility. But we also need to hold the companies accountable to their sustainability commitments. So be sure to look for the recycled content of any packaging before you choose plastic, aluminum, or glass. This is a team sport. Sustainability is something that we're going to achieve together, not in our own little silos, thinking that we're all going to act on our own without any coordination. So let's think together. And I hope you'll take a few minutes to share this podcast or any of the more than 390 other interviews that we produced on sustainability in your ear. You know, if you take a moment to write a review on your favorite podcast platform, it will help your neighbors find us. You folks are the amplifiers that spread more ideas to create less waste. So please tell your friends, family, and coworkers they can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or any of the other fine purveyors of podcast goodness. Thank you so much for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Earth911, and we'll be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.